So I reached out to David because he is an amazing leader here to help facilitate this conversation and to chat about what we think we can expect in environmental policy and whatnot going forward. But before we dive into it, David, do you want to kick it off with an introduction?
Sure. I am a co-director at Stewardship Utah. We are a brand new environmental organization as of this June. And our mission here in Utah is to protect the land, air, and water through elections, policy, and democracy. So trying to make a difference in elections. We're starting in state, local elections, but before that, spent some time as an attorney with the Southern Utah Wilderness Alliance, so worked in public lands, and I actually started a group before this to work on air and climate issues through electoral politics, and also had my own foray into running for office. So I'll
Yeah. How was
say
your,
that.
what year did you run again?
2019, I ran for mayor of Salt Lake City, and as I like to say, everybody and their dog ran that year. So, but it was a fun experience.
Yeah. Would you recommend running for office for other people?
I would actually, and we should talk about that here. That's what I'm excited to discuss with you because it is a lot of work, but it can also be a lot of fun.
Absolutely. Awesome. Well, thank you for that intro. And I'm Caroline Gleich. I am a professional ski mountaineer, small business owner, environmental advocate, and former Democratic candidate for United States Senate. My campaign just ended last week, and it wasn't the result we hoped, but we still had some really good progress that was made. And in my work as a skier, I've climbed and skied some of the highest mountains in Utah and around the world, including a successful summit of Mount Cho-Oyu in 2018. That's the sixth highest peak in the world. And then in 2019, my partner Rob and I climbed Mount Everest. And then in my work as an advocate, I have testified to the House and to the Senate. I've worked on policy at the local, state, and federal levels. I helped to work on the Inflation Reduction Act, and during the Biden-Harris administration, we helped pass the Inflation Reduction Act, which is the largest clean energy bill in United States history. And so, living in Utah, we see a lot of bad air quality. And one of the stats that I learned actually through David's organization is that the average Utahn dies 2 years earlier because of our poor air quality. And so air quality is a huge focus of my advocacy, but protecting public lands as well. And so I thought this would be a nice chat to talk about sort of how we can get ourselves organized and mentally wrap our heads around what is coming up, because I really believe that the best defense is a strong offense. So it's going to be probably a couple years of playing defense, but I'm hopeful that we can find ways to continue making progress. And please, for those of you who are joining, we would love to keep the conversation interactive. So if you haven't already shared where you're tuning in from, drop it in the chat. And also, please drop any questions you have into the chat, because David and I have some questions we are going to go through, and then we're going to open it up to Q&A. So please share your questions in the chat. Awesome. So do you want to kick it off with the first question, David?
Yeah, and before we go into questions, I just want to say too, like you, Caroline, pretty disappointing federal cycle that we just went through. It's crushing, and elections definitely result in some lows, but I'm still relatively optimistic on all the issues we're going to talk about. I hope it's not blind optimism, but I think if you leave our conversation with the idea that all is lost, then we failed, because I certainly don't think that's the case. I think we could draw on some backcountry skiing metaphors, mountaineering metaphors. One thing that I was so impressed with in this cycle is that, one, Caroline ran for Senate. And this is a big landmark here in the state of Utah. We've never had a major party candidate who ran for office with, a reputation and a resume as a climate activist, a public lands activist. And that is a big milestone for the state of Utah. Not only that, while the election result wasn't what you wanted, you did better than our last two Democrats who ran for U.S. Senate. And that, to me, that's a sign of progress on that front. Again, we don't always count progress in terms of, if you're talking about, take skiing all the lines and shooting gallery, there were probably a few that you got turned back from. But you had to train for years. You had to develop skills and techniques. And sometimes when you went to climb, like weather would turn you back or snow conditions were not right for the day. It's not really on you. I mean, that's reality. And I think sometimes we have to accept that from elections. Like, they're complex. There are a lot of things going on. But consistently, if our community shows up and we continue to build, I'm optimistic. And this last administration, I think, had so much good happen. And it was a reaction to a really sad 4 years. So I'm optimistic. I just wanted to throw that out there at the beginning. But I'd love to ask you, Caroline, a little bit to start this about your run for office. I know this is something you kind of want to just move on to. What does everything mean? But you just ran for U.S. Senate. That's a really big deal. And I'd love to talk to you a little bit about that. Maybe to start off, what were things that you came away from that experience thinking differently about elections? Like, how did that change your perspective on those?
That's a great question. I mean, it was a massive learning experience, and I particularly learned a lot about federal compliance and federal campaign finance, but I really learned, and I knew this before, but it taught me in a much bigger way that, like, you and I and the people on this call, like, we are the leaders that we want to see. Like, the people and the skills that we have as outdoors people or as caretakers or small business owners or whatever your lived experience is. You don't have to be you don't have to be a lawyer or in the military to run for public office. Like, we need more people from whatever walk of life. So whatever your background and your experience is, it's necessary and needed in politics today. And it's time for us to step up and be the leaders and the voices that we want to hear, because it's easy to sit on the sidelines and to be critical of our leaders. And that's also really important. So don't stop doing that. But also, democracy is a game that only works when you play. And I think that I learned the love of the game, because you don't always win the game, but you don't tell LeBron James not to show up for a game with an NBA, like an NBA game, or the championships, because he might not win. Like, you do it for the love of the game. And if you can bring that perspective to political engagement and running for office, I think it can make it more fun in the face of some of the challenges we have in Utah, some of the challenges we have going forward. And David, I really liked what you said about the mountains you don't climb, because from the minute I first picked up a copy of the Shooting Gallery, which is this deep skiing guidebook in the Wasatch, it took me 15 years from first picking up that book to when I finished the project. And there's going to be time. I broke my foot and I tore my ACL and I had all these different things happen that were setbacks. But you don't let the setback, you don't quit the project because you had a setback. So I see, like, the path to progress is not always linear. And sadly, I think America has headed on the wrong trail. And I hope that we correct course and get back on track. But sometimes you have to go down the wrong trail a little bit to find your way. And I guess, like, at the end of the day, I feel really proud of the work we did with the campaign and everybody who participated. We had a super volunteer, Rick. Shout out to Rick on the call here right now. Shout out to David. Thank you so much for being so supportive for the campaign. We had so many people that participated and contributed. I couldn't have done it alone. And I think about the wins with our campaign, and we are one of the only states, Utah and Washington, are the only two states in the entire United States that moved more Democratic. About 450,000 people filled out the circle next to my name on their ballot, which is bananas, like almost 500,000. So when I feel sad, I think about that, because there's so many of us, and we reached over 8 million people through social media. And we made the party work in a state that they normally take for granted. We had someone on the stage, on the debate stage, talking to the press, making sure to ask the hard questions about their environmental voting record and public lands and all these things. And so if you aren't happy with where politics is, get involved. And we're going to talk about some other ways to do that. But I do think running for office is really important. And I think it's super important that we contest every single race. And I was bummed at the end, like to see it's really depressing, I think, to see that there were a lot of seats at the state, some of the state house seats and other seats that were uncontested. And so I'd love to help recruit more people that would run for those in the future too. So but yeah, we don't always reach the summit, but we learn more sometimes from the mountains that we don't climb and we have to turn away from, and we can always go back and try to climb them again. And we will keep going back.
You mentioned something, Caroline, where you said that you encourage people to get involved in campaigns or to run. Can you just give a concrete example of what that means to be helpful on a campaign and like what that translates into? Like
Yeah.
how do people progress from just voting for a candidate or against a candidate? What does it mean to help someone?
That's a great question. And I think it also depends on what race they're running for, because for a US Senate race, the scale I'm trying to reach people on requires enormous financial resources. And so for a seat like that, the financial contributions are enormously helpful. And I know you guys are probably so sick of people saying that. So but there's a lot of ways that you could also crowdsource and create your own little fundraising page for the candidate. And that kind of stuff is really helpful. But I think beyond that, the people that hosted events for us that were willing to open up their homes and to invite people in, whether that was for a fundraiser or for a meet and greet. And the people that reached out to our campaign and were like, we want to host an event, and then they'd set the date. And it's really not too it's pretty simple to host an event at your house for a political candidate and invite your neighbors and your friends. And that's so helpful because running a campaign, you are bombarded every day with more than you could ever possibly do. And when you have people that are willing to plan an event for you and to get people to that event for you, it gives you the opportunity to be in front of people and to build those coalitions. And so that is enormously helpful. And signing up to volunteer and to phone bank and to canvas, knock doors, that's really helpful. But I think, one of the things that I've really learned from this campaign cycle is that we do have an enormous amount of work to do to continue building coalitions. And so connecting and bridging communities, bringing together our youth leaders, elder leaders, indigenous leaders, our climbers, hunters, skiers, snowboarders, the coal miners, oil and fossil fuel workers, and especially the bros. Like we really got to find a way to bring the bros back and bring them in. And so I think that's probably one of the hardest things, and building those bridges or planning those events, like inviting those diverse coalitions to come together. I think that is a big area of focus to think about.
Maybe last question on this, and then we ought to discuss some of the things we expect from the Trump administration. Which was harder, climbing Everest or running for Senate?
Running for Senate was the hardest thing I've ever done, hands down. Because being a political candidate, it's like, oh my gosh, it's 11 months working 60 to 80 hours a week. And once your name is going to be on the ballot, and once you've raised the money, like you just feel this enormous sense of pressure every day to get up and to give your state and your country your best. And I'm disappointed with the results of my election and our national election, but I sleep well knowing I gave it everything I could, and I know I left nothing on the table. Like I poured every ounce of my heart and soul and energy, and I have a lot of energy. So it was the hardest thing I've ever done. I learned a lot, like that will apply to the mountains actually. Like since I'm not a candidate, I've actually gone out and had some PRs on the trails, which is really great because few things hurt more than being a political candidate. So now everything seems a little bit easier. But yeah, it was really hard. And I think it's just we expect a lot from our leaders, and we expect a lot from ourselves too when you're a high performing person. So it was hard to live up to the pressure every day, but I did everything I could. I know I put it all out there, and I couldn't have done it without so much support. So thank you all. Thank you, Rob. Thank you, David, Rick, everyone who supported. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. It was a massive undertaking.
Let's talk about, and this leads into the question that Rick just posted in the chat, and I think I want to hit kind of three big general areas on the environment. One, the EPA. Two, climate, specifically focused around the Inflation Reduction Act. And then three, public lands. We can just kind of pinball here. Rick mentioned the Inflation Reduction Act. Maybe I'll start on that. Climate. So bad name, great bill. Inflation Reduction Act was the big climate centerpiece of the Biden administration, and the absolute largest, most significant piece of legislation ever passed in the United States on climate, really world-leading climate legislation. This was a bill largely premised on massive subsidies and funds available for clean energy, new technologies. Modeling forecasted that this bill alone would get us most of the way to a 50% reduction in our carbon emissions by 2030. Republicans have consistently put that on the chopping block, saying that they want to get rid of the Inflation Reduction Act. I want to say I think we have a good chance to stop them on this one. I think of actually anything that this administration is likely to do, this is probably the fight that we're most likely to win. And the reason for that is that it's resulted in a huge increase in manufacturing in the United States. And we've actually seen a lot more of these funds go to red states. So places, and it's important because this is where Republicans in the House and Senate are elected. And so it's one thing to say, I don't like Democrats and their climate agenda. It's another thing to say, yeah, I want to take away funds that are going to remove solar panel plant in my district. I want to take away funds that are going to remove an electric vehicle battery manufacturing plant in my district. These things that are bringing huge industries, lots of jobs to places that haven't seen those before. Have any thoughts on the Inflation Reduction Act or on the climate front, Caroline?
Well, I was just thinking, going back to my US Senate race, and it's like my opponent, Representative, now Senator-elect John Curtis, voted against the Inflation Reduction Act and was a very vocal critic of the legislation. Yet he went to national media doing a tour of his home, highlighting the electrical upgrades and the clean energy upgrades he did to his own home, the savings that he got for those. And the Inflation Reduction Act, a lot of the things really directly benefit people's lives. The EV tax credit for $8,000, $8,000, and the incentives for heat pumps, which lower your electricity bills. They're better for the planet, and they do heating and cooling despite their name of heat pumps. It's very confusing, but we install a heat pump. We never had like air conditioning at our house before, and now with the heat pump, we can heat and cool using electricity. And so a lot of these things, even though people didn't support them, they are very valuable. They save cost. They make people's lives better. They save a lot of costs. Driving an EV saves a lot of money per year. You don't have to get an oil change. You don't have to go to the gas station. And so I think that trying to slash the Inflation Reduction Act will be pretty unpopular because it also had a cap on the cost of insulin and hearing aids and all of these other things too. So the cap on the certain drug prices. So it will be interesting to see exactly how he tries to gut it, because I think at the end of the day, these things are very popular. They save a lot of money for people. And I hope that the Biden administration can help get more money, grant money to the states before this potential change would happen. I mean, we don't know the exact timing and what his plan is and how quickly he could do this, but I would hope that we could try to get more of the money out the door to the states before it's potentially gutted, because the Inflation Reduction Act also has, it's, I think, already brought over $1 billion to the state of Utah and several hundred jobs, but it has the potential to bring up to $8 billion of clean energy investments and about 30,000 jobs to the state of Utah. And I'm sure in other states it's the same thing. So we will see. But I mean, one of the things that has made me feel slightly better, and I don't, is one of the reasons I was attracted to running for the United States Senate is because Congress has the power of the purse. And when I think about the power and the duty of the executive branch, the president has some power, right? But the president is largely a cheerleader for different causes and defining the agenda for Congress. And so I'm really trying to think to deflate the power of Trump by thinking of him in a little cheerleader uniform with like pom poms. Like, we still have good people working in Congress, not quite as many as we did before this election, but there's still really good people working in Congress. And I'm, hoping that we can, between them and other ways, try to block a lot of the things, that Trump is going to try to undo or do.
Got a lot of questions about the Inflation Reduction Act or things building off of that. I think we got to come back to, I want to flag a few other things though on this front. Probably the two most important policies from the Biden administration affecting both climate and air are two big rules from the EPA. One is a rule around car tailpipes that the idea was once it's implemented, especially by 2030, between 2030 and 32, the administration expected 57% of all new vehicles sold in the US to be electric vehicles. This would start requiring automakers to meet a certain emissions standard for all cars that they sell by 2027. It's a really big, important rule that I am sure this administration, well, I was going to say I'm very sure the administration will go after, but the funny thing here is Elon Musk. That's the wild card, because Tesla is a huge beneficiary of this standard. The other one I would flag is the administration issued a rule around gas and coal-fired power plants that in practice would require significant reductions, and probably every single coal plant would close as gas plants will close in the future because of just the cost of meeting these combined with the continually dropping costs of renewables just would make the gas and coal uneconomical. But that one for sure, the Trump administration will go after.
Yeah. And I mean, what another thing I think strategically that is an interesting thing to think about, it's a little bit more challenging, but one thing that gave me a lot of hope this summer, David, was seeing your daughter being one of the plaintiffs for the youth lawsuit against the Utah legislature and having the Utah Supreme Court hear these youth leaders, sue the Utah legislature. Do you want to talk more about that? Because when I think about ways to block this stuff in the first 2 years of the Trump administration, I think about the courts, because the courts are one place. We need a lot of volunteer lawyers basically in order to do this well, but there has been successful wins in the courts. So maybe you could share a little bit about that and the youth, the right to life.
Despite how scary the U.S. Supreme Court is and how political it is, and our federal courts generally, we still do have good courts, and I think they'll be really important during the Trump administration. A great group, Our Children's Trust, is leading a series of lawsuits, both federally and then throughout the states here in the United States, where they represent kids challenging different policies in their state government that ignore the impacts of climate change on their future. And my daughter's part of a lawsuit here in Utah. There's a pretty famous lawsuit that was in the news for a while in Montana, where a court agreed with a similar group of plaintiffs that the state of Montana was not taking into account the future of the plaintiffs, these young plaintiffs. when it made decisions to promote and authorize and lease land for oil and gas development. Or sorry, there I think it was largely coal. But I think that's one way that we'll see some pushback. Should we talk a little bit about some of the things we're concerned with on the public lands front as well? Caroline, you want to kick us off there?
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to chat a little bit about what we saw when Trump took office the last time. And I guess one of the biggest things I'm concerned about in Utah is the national monuments, the Bears Ears Grand Staircase. And then these attacks on our public lands have just become so much more sophisticated. And I'm really concerned about the Utah State Legislature's Stand With Our Land PR campaign and their movement suing to try to retake 18.9 million acres of Utah's federally protected public lands. So these are BLM lands, and they're trying to overturn them to the state of Utah. And the vast majority of the time that federally protected public lands are returned to the state, they are sold to the highest bidder for privatization, for mining, drilling, or other private interests, and they're closed to the public forever. And we know that our public lands in Utah, like talking to folks on the campaign trail, and we know that these are national treasures. They are the favorite things that people love about living in Utah. And so I'm really worried about this because the Utah State Legislature has also put millions of dollars into this PR campaign. They're doing commercials, they're doing billboards to try to create the political will to undo this. And they're just, I mean, the messaging is really bananas. And so I'm pretty worried about that. I'm worried about Bears Ears. I'm worried about Grand Staircase. I'm worried about our BLM lands. And when I think about Bears Ears in particular, I think about tribal leadership because our tribes and the Bears Ears Intertribal Coalition, these 5 tribes came together when Bears Ears was cut, and then they sued the Trump administration. And that was a really effective and powerful way to, try to block the dismantling of the national monument. And so highlighting tribal leadership and building those coalitions from environmentalists to outdoor lovers, really elevating and taking the lead of our tribes, I think for Bears Ears is a really powerful way that we can help get ahead of what's likely to be another massive undoing of our national monuments. And then in terms of the BLM stuff, David, what do you think? How can we try to block this? How can we change the narrative too? Because this PR campaign is crazy how much money they're putting behind it. How did that get signed off on? This is our money they're spending.
Well, yeah, Utah legislature, I mean, we've come to expect this from them, but I would say this administration, again, also not widely known, but in the same way developed the most ambitious, impressive climate policy we've ever seen from an administration. I think is the most impressive public lands administration we've ever had. So in addition to here in Utah, for example, restoring Bears Ears and Grand Staircase Escalante National Monuments, they had a few different really important public lands rules that this administration will definitely go after. One was, and a lot of these they're a little bit weedy, but essentially what they were doing is the main agency that manages our public lands, the employees, when they go to work, have very direct regulations that tell them you should process oil and gas development, you should process mining applications, you're here to authorize grazing on public lands. And not something similar where they're working as extensively on conservation. And this administration really worked to elevate that. So on a daily basis in the office, employees were having to proactively advance conservation. And all of those rules are threatened. And I'm nervous about that. And on the monuments, we should say, I expect that this administration will there are at least 4 monuments that they'll want to rescind in the United States. 3 of them are here on the Colorado Plateau: Grand Staircase, Bears Ears, and I practiced the name, so let me see if I can get it. Baj Nawabjo, Ita Kukveni, Ancestral Footprints National Monument down in Arizona. Both Bears Ears and Baj Nawabjo, both tribally led proposals. So what do we, I think we ought to just jump into, we've got a lot of questions here about what do we do about that? So this isn't all doom and gloom. One I want to say is anytime you see anyone from your federal delegation, whether you're here in Utah or outside of Utah, definitely let them know that these issues are important to you. Public lands, you don't want to see the state take control of public lands. You don't want to see monuments rescinded. And you don't want to see the Inflation Reduction Act changed. I think that's a critical thing. There's a good study out there showing that Republican members of Congress in particular tend to hear from a smaller sample of constituents and tend to hear more one-sided comments. They don't hear from us, and I'm as guilty of this. Like, I oftentimes feel like, what's the point in reaching out to our delegation? But they need to hear from us. They need to understand that this is something that people don't like. So that's definitely one step that people should be taking.
Yeah, I would add on to that, and I would say shout it from the rooftops. Any chance you have, like someone we were talking about, someone had a question too about how do the Dems break through and get the word out about what we did and take credit for. I have had so many arguments now in my comments, which normally I don't get too much in the comments with people, but there's like this crazy amount of rhetoric that we have to make sure people know what Biden Harris did for the climate with the IRA. Like the IRA is a huge deal. Like, I think there's still an opportunity in these last 2 months of the year to shout from the rooftops the benefits of the IRA, and also to talk about the public lands wins for the Biden administration, because David, like you said, this administration, Biden Harris protected more public land than any other administration in United States history by the millions of acres. And so from a pure conservation perspective, they've contributed enormously to protecting our treasured lands. And I don't think that narrative has been communicated nearly wide and far enough. And so I think to shout that from the rooftops, however we can, like to get that in front of people, to keep that message going and going, so that the Trump administration, I mean, I have had all these people that are like, Trump was really good for public lands. And I'm like, where are you getting this? Like, he was the worst president in the United States. He undid more protections for more acres of public lands than he was the worst. And Biden was the best for public lands, and the same for environment. And so, we have to really get that message out there. And I think another thing to think about when we're asking what we can do, it's like that Venn diagram of like what the world needs, what I'm good at, and then finding that overlap, that ikigai, it's called. It's like this Japanese concept of finding your purpose. And for some, I look at the lessons of history and I look at activists like Julia Butterfly Hill, and her thing was like chaining herself to the trees. Or there's different levers. Or I look at Jane Fonda, who she got arrested a lot protesting the lack of climate action. Or I think of Greta Thunberg, or I think about so many, other youth leaders or leaders throughout history. And you can learn a lot of those lessons about how people, Rosa Parks, she sat on the bus, she wouldn't give up her seat. Like, there's a lot of ways that we can make change. And it's not always like a simple one size fits all, because we all have a different capacity. We all have different skills. Like, letters to the editor are really helpful. So write those, and like also format them so you can post them on social media or Substack or Medium or all of those places. And then, I mean, I think the other big thing that I'd love to get into is just the power of grassroots advocacy. And the power of joining your local grassroots nonprofit and a lot of my advocacy started by, I went online, like I read this book, Canaries on the Rim, which was written by the founder of Heal Utah, about Utah's history of environmental abuse. And I went online and I signed up for Heal Utah's email newsletter. And from there, I went to their lobby night training, and I learned how to show up and to be a lobbyist and to give public comment. And these organizations, like David's organization, Stewardship Utah, and Heal Utah, like there's so many good ones right now. And the simplest thing is to sign up for their email list and open the emails and do the calls to action. Like Slack, even if it's just signing a petition, like that's a great first step. But from there, like if you have the capacity to take that lobby night training and to learn how to give comments or to learn how to, whether it's written comment or public comment, like we're going to need a lot of hands on deck for that kind of stuff going forward. And it's a great time to learn right now.
Yeah, and I agree with that. I think it's all about, looking at what you can do and how can you personally take one step beyond where you are right now. If right now you're just reading things on social media, keep doing that, but start to engage in some of those calls to action. If you've written to your representative in Congress, do it again. Ask for a meeting with your representative. Try and take one step beyond where you are. We had a lot of specific questions in here on some of the policy, and I'd love to touch on some of those because to me they tie into this issue. Why get involved? Why even try? First of all, the Inflation Reduction Act. One thing I would say there, really do think it's our best effort to, is the biggest win from this past administration. I do think it's our best chance to stop the worst instincts of the Republicans. And there's a question in there: how do they do it? Can we have someone like a John McCain? I think all of those things are possible. This is a big, complex spending bill. The Republicans always could cherry pick different parts and kill different incentives. That may be what they do. The downside of that is that then it's harder for them to corral their caucus to vote down, some very weedy incentives. So there will be a lot of discussion about the Inflation Reduction Act. And I'd say, look, Republicans in this space have had it really easy. They've been the party in opposition. They've basically been the equivalent of social media shit posters, just saying that this is bad and voting against it because it didn't have any consequences. It didn't mean anything. But now when they vote on this, it's going to mean a loss of jobs. It's rank hypocrisy. Republicans say that they're the party of the people. They want fairness. Giving our public lands to fossil fuel companies, saying that our energy policy is going to be written by some of the biggest companies in the world, like Exxon, that's absurd. And I think this is an opportunity for us to help them align their values and their rhetoric with a really good piece of legislation. And that's why I would encourage people in particular to focus on that one. John Curtis, as you've said, he talks a big game on climate, but his voting has never lined up with what he says. Let's get him to line up his values. Like, we're pushing in a good direction. We're just pushing to make somebody more honest. And that's why I feel optimistic about the Inflation Reduction Act. And it's especially us reminding Curtis that everything, his rhetoric is not lining up with where he needs to be on this.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think one of the orgs I really like that does national work, y'all, is the League of Conservation Voters too. And like so my opponent for the Senate, who's our senator elect, he's like, oh, I'm a great champion for the climate. Well, it turns out, per the League of Conservation Voters, they give different legislators their environmental voting records scorecard. The NRA does the same. Like a lot of these orgs do that. And he has a worse environmental voting record than Senator Mike Lee. And we know Mike Lee is really bad. That's like the bottom of the barrel. He is lower than that. And so we need to keep the pressure on him and these other guys that say they're pro-environment to really increase that percentage. John Curtis is at a 6% lifetime, and he was at a 3% for 2023, which means that at almost every opportunity he had to vote on something that would protect our air, water, and public lands, he voted against it. So to really point out the disconnect between someone's words and actions, and that accountability piece is super, super important. So another resource I wanted to share too for finding your environmental nonprofits in your area is Patagonia Action Works. And if you just type in Patagonia Action Works, And then you go to their website, you can type in your zip code or your city and state, and it will connect you. It will show you a list of environmental nonprofits in your area. I'm dropping the link in the chat right now. And you can go and pick and be like, oh, I'm aligned with the birds, and you can work for the bird advocacy organization and whatever skills you have that line up with what they need. It's a great tool to help find these organizations like David's Stewardship Utah, wherever you are. So I highly recommend checking that out. And League of Conservation Voters too is really great at a national level.
Caroline, we got a question about, I think actually two questions that relate to the state of Utah's lawsuit on public lands. One is, could there be a counter lawsuit to that? And then the other is, how do we work to keep lands accessible, fight to not have them sold for development? Maybe let's talk a little bit about that public, what the state, what it is that we're talking about when we say the state is trying to take over our public lands and what we can do to counter it.
Yeah, do you want to go a little deeper on that?
Sure. Yeah. So the state of Utah, and I put this in a historical context. Utah joined the United States in 1896, and when it became a state, the federal government said, "Here are a bunch of things we're going to require of you. Like one, you have to put in place a constitution that protects democracy, allows people to vote. You also have to agree to some things, and we'll give you lands for your schools. Here are a lot of things that we'll give to you in exchange for this." One thing that the United States said was that Utah had to forever disclaim any public lands in the state. It's in our state constitution. Doesn't take a law degree to just look it up on the internet, where the state of Utah says we forever disclaim any interest in, technically they say, unappropriated federal lands. Now, Utah, in blatant disregard of that, is going to the U.S. Supreme Court and asking the U.S. Supreme Court to determine that it's illegal for the federal government to hold public land. As a lawyer, I would say their legal backing in this case is laughable, non-existent. Case law is absolutely established here. No court on earth that follows precedent would overturn it, but a political court might. And our U.S. Supreme Court is exactly that. So yeah, I'm a little nervous that if they take up this issue for the first time, we might have a federal court that overturns more than 100 years of precedent. But I'm also optimistic that this is, ramifications of doing that are so clear. It's so obvious that the state of Utah doesn't have a case. But this really is a political endeavor, not so much a legal endeavor. And that's, again, where I think people come in, can play a key role, because if it's not for courts to decide, it really is a political issue. And it's up to us to, one, let our elected officials know that we don't like it. Two, call out how wrong this is, because at the end of the day, I think most Utahns aren't really paying attention to this issue. And when Utah's legislature or a congressional delegation say life is so unfair, we have these unelected federal bureaucrats who control our land, sure, that narrative's easy for people to say, like, sure, I don't like bureaucrats in DC. I don't like the feds telling us what to do. But what they don't understand is all these lands that they own today. What this means is that if the state of Utah succeeds, they lose their lands. The state of Utah has done studies saying they can't afford them. Their only path forward is to sell off public land. The other thing, if there was any legal footing for them at all, what the Supreme Court would be required to do is not turn the land over to the state. They'd be required to make the feds sell the land. And I just don't think people understand that they would be the losers in this case. So reminding people, you're not taking back land. This is land you never owned. We own this land. This is our land. And we don't want you to take it from us. We don't want it privatized. So I do think that's really the key front here. It's not so much a litigation strategy. It's really a political strategy. We'll probably know by January if the Supreme Court is going to take up Utah's petition. I assume they won't. I'm still optimistic on that front. If it ends up in a lower court, it actually provides lawyers a great chance to take the case to the Utah Supreme Court and argue that the state of Utah is violating its constitution and statehood commitment.
Wow. Yeah. Do you think that there's also any possibility for accountability at the city or county level? Like, is there anything that if they were in a, Grand County, for example, um, is there anything we could do with that?
We're trying. I think that's a really great question. If we can show almost in any either local or state race, or if it's a legislative race, that some of our big backers of this, that there is an electoral price, I guarantee that'll change the calculus because it really has been a free ride here in Utah. So if we can start getting county commissioners who back this, city officials who back this, especially state legislative backers, if we can get them to pay a price when they run for office, even if it's, in a Republican primary losing to another Republican, I do think that will start to change things on this front.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, this is unrelated to the public lands issue, but when I think about some of the most long-lasting wins that I've made in my work as a climate advocate, I think about a city council meeting I went to in 2016 where Park City's council voted to go 100% renewable by 2030. And when I compare that with the things I worked on, I worked with Obama's administration on the Clean Power Plan. And then that was undone by the Trump administration. And we can really also see a lot of those long-term gains if we get involved, especially as we think about the next 2 years. Like it's a lot easier too to get a meeting with your city or county council people than it is with our national and federal reps. And so I think to start knocking on those doors as well and seeing if there's places, and I know with Great Salt Lake and with other issues that there's places where we can make progress and have wins at the city and county level. And sometimes those are more long lasting. So I think that's an idea for the next 2 years. And then hopefully in 2 years, like we'll be able to regain some power in the midterms.
Caroline, I'm really glad you brought that up, and I feel bad that I didn't mention it either. If you're here in Utah, the Community Renewable Energy Program is the biggest thing we have going at the state level to decarbonize. So it's a coalition of cities that are switching to 100% clean electricity by 2030. If you're in Salt Lake City, if you're in Park City, Holiday, Mill Creek, Midvale has joined the program. We have a city, Sandy, that is thinking about joining. If you're in one of those cities, and like Caroline said, if you ask to meet with your city council representative and your mayor, I almost guarantee you, if you do that and you get a group of friends, if you get 5 people to go to a city council meeting, you will be the biggest group of people showing up either in support or opposition of this. It doesn't take a lot of people. This will lead to massive change. It really is the biggest thing happening in the state of Utah to decarbonize. So I think that's a great one. And Samantha, I see in the chat, is posting some information on the Community Renewable Energy Program. So we're going to have some votes coming up in cities where they decide finally whether or not they want to ultimately stay in the program. So almost everyone in Utah is going to have an opportunity coming up really quick at their city level to do something really significant on climate.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really like I'm so excited about that work that's happened at the with Park Cities Council and how it's really set the stage for that to be a model for so many other cities around Utah and around the country with Mountain Towns 2030. So that's really exciting. And then I wanted to also chat really quick before we wrap up about the Antiquities Act, because do you think, David, we're probably going to see a major, do you want to give a rundown or I can talk about the Antiquities Act?
Yeah, let's tell people why it's important. And that's good. This is definitely something we need to discuss.
Yeah, yeah. The Antiquities Act is basically the mechanism that presidents have used since, for a long time to
1904.
Thank you, David, to create national monuments. And so the Trump administration and so many of these Republican legislators have said that they want to revise the Antiquities Act. And so I know that when I was working on policy during the last Trump administration, we did a lot of defense of the Antiquities Act. And I think if we could get ahead of that messaging now, it would set us up for success when these attacks are coming. Do you want to speak more to Antiquities Act and
Yeah, why it's so important is almost any national park you care about started as a monument, and it was designated by the president, not by Congress. So here in the state of Utah, Zion National Park, Arches National Park, Capitol Reef National Park, Bryce Canyon National Park, 4 out of 5 were originally monuments that were designated by the authority that the president has under the Antiquities Act as national monuments. And then later on, Congress came by and said, like, oh, I guess this place Zion is pretty cool. Maybe we should make it a national park. Congress rarely does that at the start. Actually, last month I was in another one. The Grand Canyon started as a national monument. And how these play out is always the same. The president designates a national monument. The local delegation cries and screams and says, not this place, this isn't cool. Like literally this happened with the Grand Canyon. And this should sound exactly like what the Utah delegation did with Grand Staircase and Bears Ears. It always works this way. Republicans will go after the Antiquities Act, incredibly powerful tool that presidents have used to protect landscapes. So definitely one that we have to let our representatives and our senators know is important to us.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think, you know, if you want to share it on, so to create some messaging around this, any way we can help megaphone the importance of the Antiquities Act now to get ahead of this, because we know this attack is coming. We know we're going to have to go to bat to defend the Antiquities Act. So tell everybody in your life how rad the Antiquities Act is and how we want to not have, we don't want to see any gutting or changes. We want to keep the Antiquities Act intact. And then I wanted to just share also some resources. It's the Antiquities Act is national. So this is it is a executive tool that the president has it's how President Obama created Bears Ears and Grand Staircase, Escalante. And yeah, throughout presidential administrations in the history, they have used the Antiquities Act. So it's national. Although, like that being said, there are a lot more public lands in the Western United States. I mean, it's been used a lot more in the West than it has in the East, I think, just because we have more swaths of like wilderness in the West than we do in the East.
Well, in public land, it just authorizes the president to set aside land that's already public as a protected space.
Yes. And then, so yes, it's national. And then the last thing I just wanted to talk about is resources if you want to run for office. And so there's so many great orgs now, and I would love to see folks that are interested in this get their name out there and run for office. And so there's like Run for Something, Leaders We Deserve. I did my first training as a candidate through a Utah organization called Utah Women Run. And then I did another training through a national organization for women called Emerge America. But there's so many organizations. Another one is Contest Every Race. And at every level, we need to have candidates running for office. And it's a really great way to take the issues you care about and to have a much bigger megaphone. And it's not, I mean, running for US Senate, it was a big undertaking, but there's a lot of other seats that are not quite the time and money commitment to run for. And so if you all have any questions about that, I'm happy to share those orgs or give any resources, because I would love to see as much engagement in the midterms coming up in 2 years, you know, that we get the same kind of turnout as we do for the presidential.
Yeah, I think maybe my last remarks would be it's really depressing where we are. Definitely, we're going to be playing a lot of defense. There's a lot at stake in the next 4 years, but I also think there's reason for hope. Don't give up. Like, we can make a difference. I started my organization, O2 Utah, largely as a response to the Trump administration. Rural Utah Project, the other group that we merged with, started during the first Trump administration. The Inflation Reduction Act, I think those policies really grew out of a response to what happened in the first Trump administration. The Community Renewable Energy Program, the one that we talked about, the biggest thing happening in Utah to decarbonize, was really an effort of 2 cities and a county that during the dark days of the Trump administration were saying, what can we do? And I think there are a lot of things significant and beautiful that can grow from this moment if you stay involved.
Yes, I'm with you. It's, I mean, take space and find places for joy and for nourishment right now, because come January, we are going to have our work cut out for us in terms of fighting and defending the progress we've made. But We're not gonna back down. We're gonna keep showing up and speaking up, and we'd love to keep the conversation going. So please keep in touch. I'm gonna drop my email in the chat, and would love to connect and keep in touch about how we can take this this energy we have, this desire to do something, and to keep it going. And yeah, we'll play defense for a little bit, but yeah, just progress isn't always linear like we want it to be. And so we have a setback, but just like when you cut off the arm of a succulent, it grows back in a beautiful way. We're going to bring that same kind of spirit and regrowth. Well, thank you all for attending. Thanks for joining us for this conversation. Thank you, David. Really appreciate it. And
Thank you, Caroline.
we're going to keep it going.